Today we're going to start our unit on genetics, and I always like this part of biology because genetics can be really interesting. It's something that really you can relate to because it explains a lot about you and where you get certain characteristics from which parent, and how is it you have a characteristic that seems like neither one of your parents have. It all has to do with the way that these genes are being expressed. So I want you to write these down. These are the key ideas for this lecture. I want you to be able to define a chromosome and define genes. What are chromosomes and what are genes? You should understand what traits are and how they're passed on. You need to know the difference between a phenotype and a genotype, and to understand how dominant recessive genes are expressed. So we're going to look at these genes, the dominant genes and recessive genes, a lot more later on. We have a different kind of a lab that we can look at to see where you got some of the traits that you have. So I want you to understand pure dominant and pure recessive traits versus hybrids. So genetics is the study how certain traits are passed on from one generation to the next. And so remember, we talked about DNA at the start. DNA is responsible for, of course, controlling cell division, making protein, and determining the traits that are going to be inherited or passed along from individual to individual. So we're going to look at those traits and see how you got certain traits from your mother. How did you get certain traits from your father? We're going to see that there's thousands of different traits. Not all of them get expressed so that in a way that you can see them. Some are only kind of hidden, and you can only determine them through genetic testing. So traits are those characteristics that show themselves in a living thing. And again, you can see some traits, and other traits you cannot tell that you have until you've been tested for them. So hair color, eye color, the texture of your hair, is it curly or is it straight? Your height, color of your skin, all of these things are traits, and they're passed on from your parents to you. And the genes are going to decide what those traits are. So remember, we were talking about DNA, and DNA is what coils around and forms these things called chromosomes. And chromosomes have thousands and thousands of areas on them that code for particular proteins, and that's what those genes are. So genes are segments of DNA on a chromosome that codes for a particular protein, and that protein is going to decide your traits. So remember, the DNA is an incredibly long molecule, and in order for it to be packaged and be able to fit inside the nucleus, it gets coiled around and around, and it's forming these things called chromosomes. And each little section on that chromosome, each little DNA section, is going to be called a gene, and it's going to code for that particular protein. So this is where our traits come from. And so there's thousands and thousands of genes on a individual chromosome. So we're going to see that there's thousands of different types of proteins that can be produced. So the proteins decide the traits, and each chromosome holds thousands of genes. Therefore, each chromosome can hold thousands of traits. Watch this video and answer the questions. Remember when we were looking at meiosis and we were seeing as these homologous pairs of chromosomes started to line up, and there was an event that we said was called crossing over, where one bit of DNA gets switched with another bit of DNA from its corresponding chromosome. And it has to be the same part. It's going to be a gene for gene type of a swap. So genes that are kind of matching on one chromosome and another are referred to as alleles. So these are different versions of the same gene that can give a different version of a trait. So it doesn't give a different trait, it just gives a different version of that trait. So again, we said you have genes that code for a particular trait for your type of hair texture, whether it's going to be straight, whether it's going to be curly, is it going to be fine, or is it going to be coarse? Well, we get those different alleles from each parent. So you don't just get the same trait from each parent. Otherwise, everybody would look the same. Your brothers and your sisters would look identical to you. We get these little bit of different versions, and that came from that crossing over during meiosis. So each gene can have 2 or more possible alleles, and humans have 2 alleles or versions of each of the same gene. And again, one of those comes from mom, one of those comes from dad. So one version comes from your mother, and the other comes from your father. So remember, alleles are like matching genes. They are the gene that is going to code for the same thing, but on a different chromosome. So here's an example. We have these 2 homologous chromosomes. On each chromosome, we have a gene that codes for your particular eye color. Now, this looks kind of simple, and eye color is not just coded by one gene or one allele. There's like hundreds of different alleles that are going to give you your eye color. If not, everybody that had brown eyes would have the exact same shade of brown. Everyone that had blue eyes would have the exact same shade of blue, and it's not that way. There's all different kinds of brown, hazel, real dark brown, light blue, gray blue, and that's because we have these alleles. They're the same gene, but they are a little bit different in how they're going to express that trait. Same thing for blood type. Hair color and growth, how tall you're going to be, is coded for genetically, and you can have a gene that says, oh, you're going to be really tall, versus its matching allele that says, no, you're not going to be so tall, you're going to be short. And then again, we'll look and see who wins. How do you decide which gene is going to be expressed? So eye color, again, not so simple. We don't just have one shade of brown eyes, one shade of blue, green, or gray. Many different shades, again, because of these different alleles. It's not just one allele giving you one color. Same thing with hair color. You don't see people with the exact same shade of brown all over or blonde. Again, different alleles give you those different variations. So genotype versus phenotype. When we talk about something's genotype, we're going to talk about what its gene is actually coding for. When we talk about a phenotype, we're going to see, well, how is that expressed? How does that look on the organism? So a lot of genes do not get expressed so that we can tell with a phenotype. Things like your blood type, you can't tell by looking at an organism what blood type it is. You would have to actually look at that, the genotype, to determine that. Same thing with, are you a carrier of certain type of disease? Again, you can't tell that by looking at the way the organisms look. You have to look at its genotype to figure that out. So genotype are the traits that are on the genes themselves. And those are the genes that are going to code for the proteins, which are going to cause those traits to be expressed. Now, it's how they're expressed determines if it's a genotype or a phenotype. So if you've got a gene that codes for curly hair, that's your genotype. But when we look at the individual and the individual has curly hair, that's its phenotype. So the phenotype is the physical proof of that gene's expression. And that's the way the organism looks. So most of the time you can tell by looking at a phenotype what the genotype was. But you can't always look at a phenotype and then determine what all the genotypes are. Some of them are not being expressed. So your genotype says you've got a gene that codes for curly hair. The phenotype shows that. It's the proof because you've got curly hair. You got a genotype that says you are going to have brown eyes. Your phenotype proves that by showing that you have those brown eyes. So remember that you get one set of chromosomes from each parent. So you receive one gene for each trait from each parent. And those genes can be classified as being dominant or being recessive. And we'll see how in order for a recessive gene to be expressed and not be covered up by a dominant one, you would have to get two recessive genes, one from each parent, in order to have that trait be expressed. So watch this video and answer those questions. And we'll talk about these dominant genes. These are genes that are going to cover the other trait. And remember, you have on your alleles, you have these matching genes. If one of them's dominant, it doesn't matter what the other one is, it's going to be the one that's expressed phenotypically. And so the dominant genes are the boss genes. So a living thing has two dominant traits is said to be pure dominant. Now, you cannot tell, again, by looking at a phenotype if something is pure dominant, because the gene that codes for brown eyes is dominant over the gene that codes for blue. So if you look at a phenotype and that person has brown eyes, you can't say, oh, they have both parents had brown eyes and so they're pure dominant. It could have one parent with a recessive gene for the blue eyes. We can't see it phenotypically because it's always going to be covered by the dominant gene. So you can tell by looking at an organism if it has a dominant gene, but you cannot tell if it's pure dominant just by looking at its phenotype. But you can tell the genotype by looking at someone with recessive phenotype. So if we have an individual that has blue eyes, that blue gene is a recessive gene and can always be covered up by a dominant gene. So in order for someone to have blue eyes, they have to have both of those recessive genes, one from the mother, one from the father, in order to be expressed. That way, if we see someone who's got a recessive trait being expressed, we know that they are pure recessive. So recessive genes are the genes whose trait is sometimes hidden, even though it may be present. So if you have brown eyes, you may have a recessive gene for blue eyes. You wouldn't know until, and we'll look at these things called Punnett squares later, you wouldn't be able to tell if you were able to pass on that gene unless you had a partner that also had that recessive blue. Then there's going to be a chance that those two recessive genes can show up, and it's possible for two brown-eyed parents to have a blue-eyed child. So a living thing with two recessive genes is said to be pure recessive. Now, hybrids are going to be individuals that have both. You have a recessive gene and you're going to have a dominant gene, and it's going to be for the same trait. So we'll see these things called hybrid crosses or dihybrid crosses, and we'll do these exercises called Punnett squares later, and you'll be able to look at the genotype of one parent and the genotype of another parent and look at the probabilities of what the phenotypes would be of their offspring. Summary time, you know what to do using your own words and at least 5 sentences, complete sentences. Summarize the main points of this lecture. Remember, it has to be your own words. I'm not going to give you credit if you just kind of Google search something. And I know what you know. And so some of the summaries that I've been seeing, I don't believe are your own. So make sure you do that because that's 5 points. That's half of this note-taking guide.